Today, we're diving deep into The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, a book that quietly overturns almost everything we assume about what it takes to be good with money. It has nothing to do with math. Here's the problem this book solves. We tend to think financial success is a matter of intelligence, formulas, and information, that if you just study the right spreadsheets, learn the right theories, and pick the right stocks, wealth follows naturally. Housel spent years as a financial journalist watching that assumption fall apart again and again. He watched brilliant people with finance degrees and access to every piece of market data imaginable, make catastrophic decisions with their money. And he watched people with no formal training at all, ordinary workers with modest incomes, quietly accumulate more wealth than doctors and lawyers ever did. The gap between those two outcomes had almost nothing to do with knowledge. It had everything to do with behavior. That's the entire thesis of the book, distilled into a single sentence. Doing well with money isn't necessarily about what you know. It's about how you behave. And behavior is notoriously hard to teach in a textbook, because it's shaped by things far more personal than intelligence: your upbringing, your fears, your ego, the era you happen to be born into, the specific lucky or unlucky breaks that landed in your particular life. Housel calls this a soft skill, not a hard science, and that reframing alone explains why so many financially savvy people still make a mess of their money, and why some remarkably unremarkable people quietly end up rich. What makes Housel's approach so compelling is that he isn't writing as an academic theorizing from a distance. He spent years as a columnist and later a partner at a venture capital firm, watching real people, not case studies, make real decisions with their actual life savings. He noticed that the driest, most technical corners of finance, tax law, portfolio theory, valuation models, were being taught extensively in business schools, while the far more decisive corner, the emotional and psychological side of money, was almost completely ignored. This book is his attempt to correct that imbalance, not with more formulas, but with stories, the kind that stick with you long after the numbers fade. Over the next half hour, we're going to walk through the core lessons that make this book so different from the typical finance advice you've heard 1,000 times before. We'll talk about why nobody is actually crazy with their money, even when their decisions look baffling from the outside. We'll separate the tangled, often invisible roles that luck and risk play in every fortune and every failure. And we'll get into why the person who looks the richest is very often not the person who actually is. Before we get into it, if you're someone who genuinely loves books like this, ideas that don't just entertain you but actually change how you think about money, risk, and the life you're quietly building, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe, tap that like button, and turned on notifications. This channel exists for people who want to think more clearly and live more intentionally, and there's a lot more of that coming. Alright, let's get into it. No one's crazy, and the invisible hands of luck and risk. Let's start with an idea Housel places right at the front of the book, because it sets the tone for everything after it. No one's crazy with money. It sounds like a strange thing to say, given how often other people's financial decisions look completely baffling from the outside. Why would someone with a stable income carry crushing credit card debt? Why would someone terrified of the stock market keep their life savings in cash, earning almost nothing, for decades? Why would a lottery winner go broke within a few years? From the outside, these choices look irrational, sometimes even reckless. But Housel's point is that nobody makes financial decisions from a textbook. They make them from their own personal history, a history built from a completely unique set of experiences that nobody else has lived through in exactly the same order. He points out that people who grew up during the Great Depression made radically different lifetime financial decisions than people who grew up during the booming prosperity of the 1990s, not because one group was smarter, but because their entire model of how the world works, whether markets can be trusted, whether tomorrow is likely to be better or worse than today, was shaped by completely different formative years. Your own relationship with money was written largely before you were old enough to question it, by watching your parents, by living through whatever economic conditions happened to define your early adulthood, by a handful of personal wins and losses that felt enormous to you and completely invisible to everyone else. This means the financial choice that looks foolish to you might be perfectly reasonable given the life the other person actually lived. And the flip side matters too. Your own choices, the ones that feel obviously correct to you, are just as shaped by your particular history as anyone else's. Housel isn't arguing that all financial decisions are equally wise. He's arguing that judgment without context is nearly always wrong, and that a little humility about why people do what they do with their money tends to make you both kinder and smarter. From there, Housel turns to a pair of forces that are almost impossible to separate in real time: luck and risk. He tells the story of Bill Gates, who attended one of the only high schools in the world in 1968 with a computer available for students to use. That single stroke of luck, a wealthy parents' association happening to buy a computer terminal at exactly the right moment in the history of technology, gave Gates thousands of hours of hands-on programming experience before almost anyone else on Earth had the opportunity. It was a critical ingredient in Microsoft's success. But Housel doesn't stop there. He points out that one of Gates's closest friends at that same school, a brilliant student named Kent Evans, who might well have become his co-founder, died in a mountaineering accident before graduating high school. Same school, same lucky access to that same rare computer, and one radically different outcome, driven entirely by risk, the equally powerful, equally invisible sibling of luck. The lesson Housel draws from this is uncomfortable but important. When we study successful people, we tend to study their decisions and assume those decisions were the entire explanation. We rarely account for the luck that quietly assisted them, or the risk that could have just as easily sunk them, the same way it sank countless equally talented people whose stories we never hear because they didn't get the lucky break. Housel's advice isn't to dismiss anyone's success as pure luck. That's its own kind of unfair judgment. It's to hold your conclusions a little more loosely, to be cautious about idolizing specific individuals and their exact moves, and to focus instead on broad patterns that tend to work across many people, many outcomes, and many decades, rather than betting everything on replicating one person's singular story. Housel extends this thinking into a related idea he calls tails. You win, the observation that in investing, and in life more broadly, a small number of outsized events tend to be responsible for the overwhelming majority of results. He points to Disney, a company whose fortunes were built on a relatively small handful of enormous hits, while a long tail of forgettable films quietly came and went without much notice. Nobody remembers Disney's failures. Everyone remembers Snow White and the handful of blockbusters that followed it. The same pattern shows up across venture capital, where a single successful investment in a portfolio can outweigh dozens of failed ones combined, and across the stock market itself, where a small percentage of companies drive the vast majority of index returns over any given decade. The practical takeaway is almost freeing once you absorb it. You don't need to be right most of the time to do exceptionally well. You need to avoid being wiped out by your losses long enough to still be standing when your version of that rare, outsized win eventually shows up. The quiet magic of compounding, and why getting rich is different from staying rich. Now let's talk about the story Housel opens the book with, because it might be the single most persuasive argument in the entire text. In 2014, a Vermont man named Ronald Reed passed away, and his obituary made headlines for a startling reason. Reed had spent his life pumping gas at a filling station and sweeping floors as a janitor at JCPenney. He wore a safety pin to hold his coat together, and nobody in his community would have described him as wealthy. When he died, he left behind an estate worth $8 million, the vast majority of it accumulated slowly, patiently, through ordinary blue-chip stocks he simply held for decades without ever touching. That same year, a former Merrill Lynch executive named Richard Fuscone filed for bankruptcy. Fuscone had an Ivy League education, a highly successful career in finance, access to every sophisticated investment strategy imaginable, and a 14-bathroom mansion he eventually lost to foreclosure. Two men, opposite ends of the financial knowledge spectrum, and the one with essentially no formal training ended up dramatically wealthier than the trained expert. Housel uses this pairing to drive home his central point. Ronald Reed didn't get rich through genius stock picks. He got rich by starting early, staying invested for an extraordinarily long time, and simply not interrupting the process. Fuscone had every technical advantage and lost it all because sustained, disciplined behavior mattered more than expertise, and he didn't have it. This is where Housel unpacks compounding, and he argues we consistently underestimate it because our intuition simply isn't built to grasp exponential growth. He points out something genuinely staggering about Warren Buffett, arguably the most studied investor in history. Of Buffett's roughly $100 billion net worth at the time of the book's writing, the overwhelming majority of it, more than 90%, was earned after his 50th birthday. Buffett wasn't simply a better stock picker than everyone else, although he certainly is skilled. He was a good investor who started young, around age 10, and then simply continued for over 75 years without stopping. Housel makes the case that if Buffett had started investing at 30 and retired at 60, most of us would never have heard his name, because the vast bulk of his fortune was built in the decades most people assume don't matter anymore. Time, not returns, was the dominant variable. As Housel puts it, his skill is investing, but his secret is time. From here, Housel draws a distinction that trips up even experienced investors: the difference between getting money and keeping money. Getting money requires taking risks, being optimistic, putting yourself out there, sometimes getting a lucky break at the right moment. Keeping money requires the complete opposite set of instincts: humility, frugality, a healthy fear of losing what you've built, and enough paranoia to assume that not everything will always go your way. Housel argues that a huge number of financial disasters happen precisely because people who are excellent at getting money never develop the very different skill set required to keep it. They assume the traits that built their fortune, boldness, aggression, confidence bordering on overconfidence, will also protect it. Usually, they don't. The people who stay wealthy over long stretches tend to be a little bit frightened, always aware that the market doesn't owe them anything, and that survival, simply staying in the game long enough for compounding to do its quiet work, matters more than any single brilliant decision along the way. Housel likes to describe Buffett's fortune using the same metaphor Buffett himself has used: a snowball rolling down a very long hill. What makes the snowball enormous by the time it reaches the bottom isn't necessarily that it started especially large, or that it rolled unusually fast. It's that the hill was extraordinarily long. A snowball given 7 to 5 years to roll will always dwarf one given 20, even if the 20-year snowball rolled down a steeper, faster slope the entire way. This is why Housel keeps circling back to the same uncomfortable truth for anyone hoping for a shortcut. There isn't one. The financial equivalent of a long hill is simply staying invested, undisturbed, for as long as humanly possible, and resisting every impulse along the way to jump off the hill because the ride feels uncomfortable in the moment. It's worth pausing on just how early that hill started for Buffett. He bought his first shares of stock at 11 years old, and by the time most people are just beginning their careers in their 20s, he had already been compounding money for over a decade. Housel isn't suggesting everyone needs to start at 11 to benefit from this lesson. He's illustrating just how much of what looks like extraordinary skill is, when you actually trace the numbers back, closer to extraordinary patience applied over an extraordinarily long runway. Never enough, and what money is actually for. Housel opens one of the book's most sobering chapters with the story of Rajat Gupta, a man who rose from modest beginnings in India to become the head of McKinsey and sit on the boards of Goldman Sachs and Procter & Gamble. By any reasonable measure, Gupta was already staggeringly wealthy and successful. And yet, he was convicted of insider trading, passing confidential boardroom information for the chance at a few million more dollars he didn't remotely need, and he ended up in federal prison, his reputation destroyed. Housel places this story right next to Bernie Madoff, a man who was already legitimately rich before he built one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. Both men had, by any external measure, already won the game. Both risked everything they had for more, and lost everything as a result. The lesson here is one of the most important in the entire book. There is no amount of money that will ever feel like enough if you don't have a clear, defined sense of what enough actually looks like for you personally. Housel calls this the single greatest skill in personal finance: not maximizing returns, not picking winning stocks, but knowing when to stop moving the goalpost. He notes something almost universal about human psychology here, that our expectations tend to rise exactly as fast as our circumstances do, sometimes faster. A raise that once would have felt life-changing gets absorbed within months into a new, slightly more expensive version of normal, and the search for more begins again almost immediately. This isn't a character flaw unique to a few greedy individuals. It's a default setting most of us are running without ever having consciously chosen it, which is exactly why Housel insists that defining enough has to be a deliberate act, something you decide on purpose, because your circumstances alone will never decide it for you. He points out that modern capitalism is exceptionally good at making you compare yourself to people slightly richer than you, ensuring the finish line quietly moves every single time you approach it. Without a personal definition of enough, every gain just resets your expectations rather than satisfying them. And that's precisely the psychological trap that pulled down two men who were already further ahead than the vast majority of the population will ever be. This connects directly to what Housel argues is money's single greatest practical value, and it isn't the ability to buy fancier things. It's freedom. Specifically, the ability to control your own time, to wake up and decide how you spend your day without someone else's permission. He calls this the highest dividend money pays, the capacity to do what you want, when you want, with whoever you want, for as long as you want. Housel points out that historically, humans have moved from working purely for survival, to working for money, to now working, ideally, for a sense of control over their own hours, and that final stage is where genuine well-being tends to live. He illustrates the trap that often blocks this freedom with what he calls the man in the car paradox. When you see someone driving an expensive car, your instinct is to admire them, or to imagine yourself in their position. What almost never happens is that you look at the driver and specifically admire the driver. You're too busy imagining yourself behind that wheel to actually think much about the person who's driving. Housel's point cuts sharply. If the whole reason you bought the expensive car was to be admired by other people, it quietly fails at its own goal, because the other people aren't admiring you at all. They're using your purchase as a mirror for their own imagination. Spending money to try to purchase other people's respect is, according to Housel, one of the most reliable ways to slowly drain the very freedom money was supposed to buy you in the first place. There's a related idea Housel introduces that reframes market volatility entirely, the notion that nothing worthwhile is free, and that includes investment returns. He compares the stock market to a theme park. If you want to enjoy the rides, you have to pay the admission fee at the gate. Investors, he argues, are constantly trying to sneak into the park without paying that fee, treating volatility, downturns, and uncertainty as an unexpected penalty rather than the actual cost of entry. But market swings aren't a fine for doing something wrong. They're the price you pay for the higher long-term returns that steadier, less volatile assets simply don't offer. Once you accept volatility as a legitimate fee rather than a punishment, Housel argues, you stop trying to escape it every time it shows up, and you stop making panicked decisions that cost you far more than the fee itself ever would have. The wealth you can't see, the power of saving, and room for error. This brings us to one of the most quietly profound ideas in the whole book. Wealth is what you don't see. Housel makes a sharp distinction between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is visible, the car in the driveway, the house, the vacation photos. Wealth is invisible, the income that wasn't spent, sitting quietly in an investment account, unseen by anyone, including, often, the people who are closest to you. He points out that when we look at someone driving an expensive car, we tend to assume they must be wealthy. But all we're actually observing is that they had enough cash or credit at one moment to buy that car. We never see the investment account they don't have, or the debt they're carrying to maintain the appearance. Spending money on visible things is, almost by definition, the opposite of building the invisible pile of assets that actually constitutes wealth. Every dollar spent to look rich is a dollar that can no longer compound quietly in the background, becoming real wealth later. This leads directly into a chapter Housel treats as almost embarrassingly simple, and yet most people ignore it entirely, the sheer power of just saving money. He argues that building wealth has surprisingly little to do with your income or even your investment returns, and everything to do with your savings rate, the gap between what you earn and what you spend. Someone earning a modest salary who consistently saves a meaningful chunk of it will often out-accumulate someone earning triple that amount who spends almost everything. And crucially, Housel argues you don't need a specific reason to save. You don't need to be saving for a house, or a wedding, or retirement, specifically. Saving for flexibility itself, for the unnamed, unpredictable opportunities and emergencies life will inevitably throw at you, is reason enough. In a world that constantly changes in ways nobody can predict, the value of a pile of savings isn't just the interest it earns. It's the optionality it hands you, the ability to change careers, weather a downturn, or take a risk precisely because you're not financially cornered. That optionality connects to another core idea: room for error. Housel argues that the single biggest mistake investors make isn't picking bad investments. It's failing to plan for the fact that their assumptions about the future will inevitably, at some point, be wrong. He compares this to an engineer designing a bridge. A responsible engineer doesn't build a bridge to hold exactly the maximum expected load. They build it to hold significantly more, because they know unexpected stress will eventually occur, and the cost of underestimating that stress is catastrophic. Housel argues your financial life needs the same margin of safety: more savings than you think you need, less debt than you're technically approved for, and a general skepticism toward any plan that only works if everything goes according to forecast. The future is fundamentally unpredictable, and the investors who survive long enough to benefit from compounding are almost always the ones who built in room for the surprises they couldn't see coming. Finally, Housel tackles something almost nobody accounts for when they build a 20 or 30-year financial plan: the simple fact that you will change. He calls this the end of history illusion, the strange psychological tendency all of us have to recognize how much we've changed in the past decade, while simultaneously assuming we've basically finished changing and will remain roughly the same person for the rest of our lives. That assumption is almost always wrong. The goals, values, and priorities you hold at 25 are very rarely the same ones you'll hold at 45 or 65. Housel's advice isn't to avoid long-term planning altogether, but to avoid the extreme ends of it, to resist locking yourself into rigid, all-or-nothing financial decisions built entirely around who you are today, because the person making those decisions will not be the exact same person living with the consequences decades down the road. Housel closes his exploration of investor behavior with an idea he calls you and me: the observation that financial markets are really a collision of enormous numbers of people playing entirely different games with the same asset. A day trader looking to make a profit in the next few hours is technically buying the same stock as a retiree investing for a horizon 30 years away, but they are not, in any meaningful sense, playing the same game. Bubbles form, Housel argues, when long-term investors start taking their pricing cues from short-term traders, forgetting that the frantic buying and selling happening around them is being driven by a completely different set of goals and timelines than their own. Knowing which game you're actually playing, and refusing to let someone playing a different game dictate your own decisions, is, in Housel's view, one of the quietest but most important disciplines an investor can develop. There's one more idea worth pulling out before we close, because it ties the entire book together. Housel argues that you don't need to be rational with your money. You need to be reasonable. Traditional finance often treats people like spreadsheet-optimizing robots, assuming the mathematically correct choice is always the right choice. But Housel points out that a purely rational strategy you can't actually stick with emotionally is worthless in practice. He gives the example of paying off a mortgage early, even when the math suggests investing that money elsewhere might technically earn a higher return. If paying off the house lets you sleep better at night, feel less anxious, and stay consistent with the rest of your financial plan, that reasonable choice will very often outperform the technically optimal one, simply because you'll actually follow through on it. The best financial plan isn't the one that wins on paper. It's the one you can live with through market crashes, career changes, and every version of yourself you'll become along the way. Housel adds one final observation worth carrying with you, about why pessimism about money and markets so often sounds smarter than optimism. Warnings of doom feel urgent and intelligent, while predictions of continued, unglamorous progress sound almost naive by comparison. But Housel points out that if you zoom out far enough, the long-term story of markets, and of human ingenuity more broadly, has overwhelmingly been one of slow, compounding progress, interrupted by real but ultimately temporary setbacks. Betting against that long arc has historically been a losing wager, even though it will always sound like the more sophisticated position to hold in any given room. Housel closes the book by turning the lens on himself, sharing his own family's financial habits, and it's a fittingly humble ending for a book about humility. He and his wife keep their spending well below their income, hold a large cash cushion mainly for the peace of mind it provides rather than any specific plan for it, and own their home outright, a decision that isn't mathematically optimal by traditional standards, but lets them sleep soundly regardless of what the market does on any given day. He's not offering this as a formula for anyone else to copy exactly. He's demonstrating, one last time, the book's central argument in practice, that the right financial plan is a personal one, built around your own temperament, your own fears, and your own definition of enough, not around someone else's spreadsheet. So let's bring this all together. If there's one idea from the psychology of money worth carrying with you long after this video ends, it's this. Your financial future depends far less on your intelligence, and far more on your behavior, sustained quietly, patiently, over an uncomfortably long stretch of time. Compounding rewards the people who simply don't quit. Wealth favors the people willing to look, for a while, less impressive than they could. And freedom, the actual point of all of it, belongs to the people who define enough for themselves, instead of letting the world define it for them. Here's the actionable piece to walk away with today. Don't try to overhaul your entire financial strategy tonight. Start with one honest question. What does enough actually look like for me? Write it down, specifically, in your own words. Then look at your savings rate, not your income, not your investment returns, just the simple gap between what you earn and what you spend, and find one small way to widen that gap this month. That's the whole first step. Everything else Housel writes about, compounding, room for error, the freedom money is supposed to buy, builds from that same unglamorous starting point. Spend a little less than you earn, invest what's left, and give it time you didn't think you had to spare. If this video gave you something to sit with, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a comment below with your favorite thought from today, the idea that hit you hardest, and let's talk about it. And if you want more conversations like this one, thoughtful, unhurried, built around books that actually change how you live, come join us. Subscribe to the Mind Master, and let's keep building a wealthier, wiser, and more patient way of thinking, one honest decision at a time. I'll see you in the next one.